This is the story of Josh Turner, the country singer whose deep bass voice defined 2 decades of Nashville music, and how a medical scare nearly silenced him before his career even started. Long before Long Black Train turned him into a platinum-selling artist, a teenage Josh Turner sat in a doctor's office being told his voice might be permanently damaged, and what happened between that appointment and his eventual breakthrough is a story built almost entirely on patience, faith, and a refusal to quit. Joshua Otis Turner was born on November 20th, 1977, in a small community called Hanna in Florence County, South Carolina, and he grew up there with a brother and a sister in a family where church wasn't optional, it was the center of everything. The Turners attended Union Baptist Church, and that's where Josh first sang in public, taking on the bass and baritone parts in the choir at an age when most kids' voices hadn't even settled into what they'd eventually become. His voice already sounded older than he was, low and resonant in a way that made people in that small congregation take notice. When Josh was 14, his mother signed him up for a church fundraiser called April Fools for Christ, and the rule was simple. Either you got up and performed in public, or you paid $25 to skip it. He didn't pay the $25. He got up and sang instead, and that small, almost forced moment in front of his own community turned out to be one of the first steps in a much longer journey. Not long after, he joined a gospel quartet called Thankful Hearts and toured small venues across South Carolina, singing in fellowship halls and community centers rather than anywhere close to a spotlight. His grandmother's house is where he first fell in love with country music itself, listening to the Stanley Brothers, the Osborne Brothers, old gospel quartets, and Opry legends like Waylon Jennings and Johnny Cash. As a teenager, he found Randy Travis and Hank Williams too, and he wasn't just listening for enjoyment. He was studying how these men built a story inside a song, how they used silence and space and phrasing to make 3 minutes feel like a whole life. He picked up a guitar around this time and started writing his own material, clumsy at first the way anyone's early songs are, working through the everyday struggles, faith, and family values he saw all around him in Hanna. None of that made him unusual yet. Plenty of talented kids sing well in church and write songs nobody outside their bedroom will ever hear. What actually shaped the next chapter of his life wasn't his talent, it was what nearly happened to it. In 1996, Josh was examined at the Vanderbilt Voice Clinic in Nashville and diagnosed with a lesion on his right vocal cord, a problem doctors attributed mainly to poor vocal habits built up over years of singing without the technique to protect his voice. He didn't need surgery, which was the good news, but the instruction that followed was almost crueler in its own quiet way: rest the voice completely for an entire year. For a teenager whose sense of identity was tied directly to that voice, a full year of forced silence meant losing the one thing that connected him to his church, his family, and who he understood himself to be. Nobody was filming this. Nobody outside his immediate world even knew it was happening, and that's part of what makes it land so hard in hindsight, because he could have simply let it go, decided the voice wasn't coming back, and moved on to some other life entirely. He didn't. It was that same serious, reflective stretch of his life, still carrying the weight of that silence, that eventually led him to the moment that changed everything, though it would take a few more years and a move to Nashville to get there. After graduating from Hanna Pomplico High School, Josh enrolled first at Francis Marion University, close to home in Florence, before transferring to Belmont University in Nashville, a school known less for producing headline acts and more for training people who work in the music business behind the scenes. That distinction matters because Belmont wasn't a golden ticket to stardom. It was a business degree with a music industry focus, and Josh Turner walked into a city already full of people exactly like him, talented, hopeful, and one face among thousands trying to make it. Nashville doesn't care how good your church choir thought you sounded, and for a while Josh Turner was just another student trying to figure out whether a childhood church solo and a recently healed vocal cord were enough to build an actual career on. Then came the night that changed the direction of his life, and it happened in a library, not a studio. Turner was already in a serious, reflective mood, shaped in part by the vocal scare he'd been through not long before when he came across a box set of Hank Williams' senior recordings in the Belmont Library and sat there listening. Walking home afterward, he's described experiencing something close to a vision, picturing a wide-open stretch of plains with a train running through the middle of nowhere and people standing beside the tracks just watching it pass. It struck him that the train wasn't just a train, it was a metaphor for temptation, and the people standing there were deciding, right in that image, whether or not to get on it. He went back to his room, picked up his guitar, and the song came out of him almost fully formed. That song was Long Black Train, and it wasn't written in a professional studio with a team of collaborators. It was written alone, by a college student still carrying the emotional weight of a year he'd spent unable to sing at all. A classmate at Belmont introduced Josh to a Nashville music publisher named Jody Williams, who signed him to a songwriting contract, and while that wasn't a record deal or anything close to stardom, it was the small, unglamorous opening that led to something much bigger. Sources differ on the exact year, with some biographies listing December 21st, 1997, and others pointing to December 21st, 2001, but the moment itself is well documented either way. Josh Turner made his first appearance on the stage of the Grand Ole Opry and introduced a song he'd written himself, and partway through the performance, the audience stood up mid-song, cheering. When he finished, the host that night, the Country Music Hall of Fame songwriter Bill Anderson, asked him to play it again, and the crowd gave him a second standing ovation. Picture the distance between those two moments: a teenager being told to stop singing for a year because something was physically wrong with his voice, and then, not many years later, that same voice bringing an entire Opry audience to its feet twice in one night. Within about a month of that performance, Josh Turner signed with MCA Nashville. Here's where the story resists the easy, clean version people expect. Signing a record deal didn't turn Josh Turner into an instant star, and his career didn't move in a straight line from that point forward. His debut album, Long Black Train, came out in 2003, and the title track, the same song born out of that vision on the walk home from the library, became his breakthrough single. It peaked at number 13 on the charts, which is respectable but far from explosive, and the other singles from that album performed even more modestly. What the chart numbers don't capture is what happened next. Long Black Train kept finding new listeners long after its initial run, and by the end of 2004 it had been certified platinum, 1 million copies shipped, on the strength of exactly the kind of slow, steady momentum that defined so much of his career. The same year that debut album came out, Josh married Jennifer Ford on June 14, 2003, right as his life was starting to shift in ways neither of them could have fully predicted. Jennifer wasn't new to his music either. She played keyboard and sang background vocals in his shows, and when it came time to shoot the music video for his song Your Man, a romantic track that needed a romantic lead opposite him, the studio didn't bring in an actress. They cast his own wife. Turner, a devout Christian, later said it would have felt very uncomfortable to have anyone else play that role, and for an artist at that early stage of fame, the easier industry move would have been a recognizable face for visual appeal. He chose his actual marriage instead. Your Man became his second album, released in 2006, and the title track gave him his first #1 single. Together, Josh and Jennifer would go on to have 4 sons: Hampton, Colby, Marion, and Samuel. What followed wasn't a rocket ship either. It was something arguably harder to sustain, a long career built on refusing to change who he was. Josh Turner became known across the industry as a country traditionalist, leaning into a deep bass baritone voice, gospel and bluegrass roots, and classic honky-tonk storytelling, even as country music around him kept shifting toward pop country and whatever radio trend happened to be dominant that year. That refusal to chase trends is a harder path than it sounds, because artists who stick to their sound often get left behind by an industry built to reward whoever's currently popular, and Turner's response was mostly just to keep working, keep touring, and keep writing about faith, love, and everyday struggle, the same subjects that had shown up in his earliest, clumsiest teenage songwriting attempts back in Hannah. He did occasionally step toward a more modern sound. Time Is Love, released in 2012, carried a more contemporary, adult contemporary leaning gloss, and became one of the biggest country hits of that entire year. Why Don't We Just Dance pushed him further into a modern setting, and the story behind that song says something about how deliberately Turner worked. He placed the song on hold with its publisher specifically so nobody else could record it first, and when another artist later expressed interest, the publisher asked Josh to record it himself just to see if he still wanted to keep it. He did, and as he's put it, he and his team felt like they simply couldn't lose that song to anyone else. Over nearly 2 decades, he built out a catalog that included Firecracker, All Over Me, and Deep South, which reached #1 on Billboard in 2017, 14 years after his debut, proof that his relevance hadn't faded the way so many country careers do after the first decade. Between 2018 and 2021, rather than chase another radio hit, he released a gospel album, a record of classic country covers, and a holiday album, 3 projects built entirely around honoring the music that raised him, the same gospel quartets and Opry legends he first heard at his grandmother's house as a child. In 2024, more than 2 decades after that first Opry appearance, he released his 10th studio album, This Country Music Thing. By that point, Josh Turner had sold more than 12.5 million units and passed 1.5 billion in global streams, numbers built up slowly, album by album, rather than through a single explosive moment. Even now, decades into his career, Turner still tours through the kind of towns that bigger country stars often skip. Places like Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Huntington, West Virginia, and New Berlin, Illinois, mid-sized cities and smaller communities that don't always get the biggest tours rolling through. Critics who've covered these shows describe them as a throwback to what originally drew people to country music, stories about everyday life, faith, love, and personal struggle, delivered in a straightforward, unhurried way rather than through spectacle. So here's what's actually true about Josh Turner's life, without anything added for effect. A kid from a town most people have never heard of nearly lost the one thing that defined him, his voice, at an age when he was still figuring out who he was. He spent a full year in forced silence, then rebuilt himself through a music program that mostly produces industry workers, not stars. A song born out of grief and reflection during that very silence came out of him almost fully formed, alone, in a college dorm room, after a vision on a walk home from a library. One night at the Grand Ole Opry could have gone unnoticed, and instead earned him 2 standing ovations. A debut hit took its time becoming a platinum success while the rest of the album underperformed around it. A marriage built in the same year Everything Changed gave him a wife who became his co-star instead of a stranger cast for the part. And nearly 20 years of refusing to chase every new trend turned into a career still being built today, one mid-sized town at a time. There's no need to invent tragedy in this story, because the real struggle is already there. In a teenager sitting in a doctor's office not knowing if his voice would come back, and in a college student writing a song alone in his room while still carrying the weight of that silence. Josh Turner's story isn't about someone who had everything handed to him. It's about someone who very nearly lost the one thing that defined him before the world ever got the chance to hear it, and got it back anyway.